Welcome. It's our third ever SHOWstudio Book Club live discussion, and we're going to be talking about the next 4 books in the wonderful Vogue On series. So we're going to be dissecting the work of 4 absolutely amazing designers, and I've also got an absolutely amazing panel with me who are the authors of these amazing titles, but I'll let you guys just introduce yourselves and explain which designer you covered in your book. I'll start with you, Kathleen.
I'm Kathleen Baird-Murray, and I wrote about Ralph Lauren.
Drusilla?
My name's Drusilla Beyfus. I'm a journalist, and my subject is Hubert de Givenchy, who was born in 1927.
I'm Susan Irvine, and I've written about Cristóbal Balenciaga, who was born in 1895.
And my subject is Vivienne Westwood, who I've worked with and known for a lot of years. Fascinating subject to write about.
So, ladies, I'll start with a relatively nice question to ease everyone in. What makes a great designer? Because obviously the point of this Vogue On series is chronicling the great designers through the archives of Vogue. What makes someone a brilliant designer? I'll let you go first, Drusilla, because you looked at me.
Well, I think a rather underrated aspect is parents that are interested in the arts. Certainly, as far as my subject is concerned, he came from an artistically minded family. His mother was an early fashionista. I think that not all designers, but I think a lot of Paris designers in particular have come from a very civilized, cultivated background. So that's something that I would rate. Also, I think there's a strong vocational aspect. I think that most great designers it's in their blood. You know, they don't think, should I go into medicine or law? They know what they want to do and they do it right from early age. That's my thought.
Would the rest of you agree with that it is about coming from a sort of a creative family and having that sense of design in your blood?
Yes, and actually Ralph Lauren, his father painted murals in houses and buildings, and so his background, I mean, he came from very humble, relatively speaking, origins. His parents came from Russia, and he grew up in the Bronx with not a huge amount of money. They were comfortable, but I think that artistic influence of his father, yes, definitely furthered him. And you're right, I think the only difference I would say is vocationally, I don't think he knew that you could be a designer, if you know what I mean. He was always drawn to it, and he was a bit like a magpie. He was, styling baseball teams when he was younger and so on, but I think it was just there. It was something that when he perhaps grew up a little bit, that sort of found him.
Let's talk about Westwood. Did she always have creativity in her?
Well, she wasn't from a cultured background.
Exactly.
At all. Her parents were working class, but they were craftspeople. They both were. Her mother worked in a mill, her father could make things. So she was from very much a maker's background. She discovered culture when she came to London. She'd never seen, she wasn't privy to that kind of world, art books and art galleries. I mean, she lived in Derbyshire. So, I'm not saying there aren't any there, but at that time,
Some of our viewers are going to be very...
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm from Newcastle, we've got art galleries, but what I'm saying is, even though I was brought up there, my parents, I didn't know anything about. I'm from a craft background as well, so it's not necessarily so that you just aren't shown those kind of things. But she was shown other things. She was shown how to make things, and her mother worked in a mill, which is a highly skilled technique. And this is how Vivian really started, by making clothes, recutting patterns. So it's that side of it. Whereas I think in the case of, particularly in Givenchy, the style and the urbaneness of that man and his background, but he's a totally different type of designer to Vivian.
And I would like to qualify my point by saying that I think it applies particularly to European continental designers, certainly not true of English designers or American designers.
Let's talk about Balenciaga in this mix. How does he fit in?
Well, closer to Vivian in his origins, but actually he came from a modest background. His father was the captain of a small customs patrol vessel, and he died when Balenciaga was 11, and his mum was a seamstress, so that was his direct connection to couture, because she used to go up to the villa of the Marquesa de Casa Torres to repair her beautiful couture clothes, and he went with her. And there's a wonderful story that maybe I'll tell you later on about how he, almost like a fairy tale of how he came to be a couturier based on his contact with her. But yes, I mean, his mum was a single mother. His first job was at the age of 12. He was apprenticed to a tailor. Like Vivienne, he was a maker, and he was a tailor always first and foremost. So not from an artistic background, he just had it in him.
Can you tell us that story now? Because I don't think I can wait. That sounds so good.
Well, I mean, one of the things I love about the story is there's so many versions of it. I mean, Balenciaga was the opposite of modern designers. I mean, you cannot imagine him with a Twitter account. He was so private. He gave one interview. And for this book, for the first time, a second interview was discovered by Miren Arzaluz. I've probably pronounced her wrong, but she's an amazing woman, the head of the Balenciaga Foundation in Getaria, his hometown. She sort of gifted to the book this second interview in which he gives a definitive version of how he came to be a couturier that wasn't known up till then. Everyone had a slightly different version that they told. Cecil Beaton said that he saw the Marquesa de Casa Torres as she was walking into church in her fine clothes, and he accosted her and said, I'd love to, she said to him, how are you going to help your mother in a few years, to sort of bring up the family? And he said, I'm going to sew fine clothes like yours. And she said, how can you sew like this? And he said, give me the linen and I'll show you. And he did. He made her an amazing suit that she wore to church the next Sunday. That's not the exact version, but there's many stories like this that are all around this encounter he had with her. And he did, in fact, encounter her. He did make her a suit at the age of 12, and he spent a couple of months, in the top floor of her sort of villa with the people that did the ironing. And you get this wonderful fingering all the clothes, the seams. You get this lovely idea of all the steam irons, the atmosphere, and all these clothes hanging up, and this little 12-year-old boy discovering Balenciaga. I'm getting carried away.
No, that's so lovely. God, I'm getting carried away as well. I do want to talk a little bit. I'm really glad that you mentioned, he only gave these. He didn't have a sort of very forthcoming relationship with the press. I think the other is he gave an interview to the Times, wasn't it? His
only other interview was to the Times.
Yeah, so very sort of closed off. And I would like to talk a little bit about designers' relationship with the press, which is obviously very fitting because this is a Vogue series. How did you find working in the Vogue archives? Did you find a lot of sort of, with the designers you worked with, were they more forthcoming than Balenciaga? Was it quite easy to chronicle their lives through their interviews? And
well, for me, it was easy and it wasn't easy because obviously Ralph Lauren, everything is chronicled. He's been designing for over 40 years. I didn't have access to him personally. I didn't interview him personally. And that was, as a journalist who's used to doing interviews with people, that was slightly like, okay, what do I do now, kind of thing. Having said that, I mean, they were very accessible in terms of supporting us with other archive images that Vogue didn't have. But the great thing is, I mean, he has been so chronicled in American Vogue, in British Vogue, in French Vogue. So it's so fantastic to read other writers' impressions and particularly, to see the growth of somebody's career from start to where we are now.
I guess that must have been quite different perhaps for someone like Westwood because, with a lot of her earlier work and some of the most exciting stuff that we love and know her for, I guess that sits outside of when Vogue picked her up. Did you find that point, where Vogue often does this when they're writing about designers, they say first in Vogue and they put that date, but with Westwood, did you find some of her most creative period was outside of her being
I think she's always, I'm a fan anyway, but I think she's always been creative. She's, so enduring, she's so tenacious, she's kept going. Definitely, obviously, Vogue they did pick up on punk slightly, but obviously, the thing is with the Westwood book really that it kind of almost sat outside the series because, the publishers were saying to me, for instance, when I was writing it, we want more Westwood, and I said, well, she's only been interviewed once by British Vogue, and that was in 1987. Vivienne doesn't do a lot of interviews like that. I mean, she kind of sits out. She's been featured a lot, but I'm talking about actually. I mean, there's loads of photographs. Obviously, the photographs have been used from her, but in actual interviews, she'd only actually been interviewed once. And in fact, it was Italian Vogue who picked up on her from the very earliest time, and that was in Anna Piaggi. Vivienne said she was one of the first people to go to the shop, and this is long before World's End, in the early days. You know, Anna Piaggi used to come to London. So when I also looked at Italian Vogue, and in fact, it was Anna Piaggi who first picked up on Vivienne, and she, on her pages, and she had, you know, the safety pins, for instance, and she was picking up on that. So Vivienne's never courted publicity. I mean, it sounds... She's kind of almost a publicity magnet in some ways, but she's never really courted it because she's too into what she does, which has changed now. It isn't just fashion anymore. And this was another slight difficulty, if you like, is that she uses fashion as a political vehicle. Yeah. She loves clothes. She thinks that the age of elegance is gone, and all that kind of thing. But she uses clothes now as a political vehicle to, you know, to back up her causes. I mean, last night, for instance, she came to the launch, but it was late because she'd been on Channel 4 talking about, you know, I think it was about the Greenpeace protesters with the Arctic. So, you know, she now uses it for that. So, in a way, it was quite complicated for this series, her particular sort of case, but she cooperated fully, and I mean, it was just a joy to do, and I know everyone will feel the same about their particular subjects.
Yeah, did you all find yourself getting incredibly attached to your designer and feeling this kind of bond there? How did you find the process of going through the Vogue archive?
Well, I'd always loved Givenchy's clothes, but as far as his relationship with the press is concerned, there's something I would like to say, which is that, so unlike his contemporaries, such as Dior and Pfaff and Balmain, Givenchy very much used himself as a promotional tool. He was terrifically good looking and was very aware of it, and so he used himself in his own advertising campaigns. And he was right sort of out there. It wasn't that he gave interviews, it just was that he was always out there in public and, you know, promoting his range. So in fact, I think I made the point that he could be seen as a kind of forerunner of people like Terence Conran and Richard Branson, in that, you know, the man was the brand, and he really pushed that.
Do you think that? I think that's a huge part of the way he's influenced contemporary fashion, because I think that's completely the norm now. You know, design.
Absolutely.
But that was completely the opposite of Balenciaga in a way.
Oh my God, completely.
Yeah.
I mean, Balenciaga, he completely shunned the press. Only gave these 2 interviews, never appeared at his own shows. He would watch, he had a sort of curtain hanging over the, from the passage from the atelier to the salon. He peeped through a small hole in the curtain, which is just a lovely, rather erotic image.
Well, we've got a kind of irony here, because my guy worshipped Balenciaga.
My guy,
I was just going to say that.
Absolutely. Balenciaga was his idol and spiritual mentor
this is the
in every
thing.
way. Yeah. And yet, there was that aspect where he didn't follow him at all.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that, because I do want to talk about this, because I don't want to put one of the designers on a pedestal, but Balenciaga.
But to every designer, I mean, I can't speak, I'm sure Ralph Lauren, but I'm talking about Vivienne, definitely, any design. Balenciaga is the master.
Why is he so great?
That's how he was known. He was known as the master. Dior said he was the master of us all. He was. Chanel said he alone is a true couturier. The others are merely fashion designers. She said that for a specific reason, because he trained as a tailor, and actually he trained in sort of British-inspired tailoring, although it was in San Sebastian. And she said that because he knew how to construct a garment from the foundation up, which a lot of designers don't do, and that's fine, but that was something that really informed how he designed, the very constructed nature of his design.
But sorry if you don't mind me, apart from that though, I mean, his sense of proportion and architecture was sublime. You know, there's no one who has ever been able to match. I mean, look at that. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, who could do that now? No one. So every other designer looks to that as the ultimate. He's like Michelangelo, really, of fashion. I wouldn't even call him. I wouldn't even use the word fashion about him, because it's a bit sort of almost too trivial for it, because it's art. It is, and no one's ever been able to match it. Well, I mean, I just, you know, why does every other designer admire him so much?
I mean, it's interesting. He's so much considered the master, the genius of the 20th century when it comes to fashion. And still, and even more so, his reputation is actually even growing. But he's not that well known to the non-fashion related public out there still.
Well, is he known to, I mean, quite honestly, I mean, you know, I'm a reader in fashion at Northern University, and how many students, you know, really look into the history and really know the Richter scale of who is up there, and, you know, like with Givenchy, and hopefully this series will enlighten people, you know, how Givenchy and Audrey Hepburn and all these connections which paint the bigger picture. You know, you have to know all of these designers to really put them, and, you know, Ralph Lauren, a sublime marketing man, you know, who's transformed the retail world, really. So, you know, but it's knowing all of them. But, you know, you have to start with I suppose that's what the series is about, is starting with the most important people, if you like.
It's a really good point. I was going to ask that later, but it's really apt now, which is I wanted to talk about the function of fashion books, because often, you know, we talk about fashion being incredibly democratic and accessible now, and I think you mentioned your students, and I think a lot of them probably use the internet for a lot of their research. Do you think that's one of the beauties of doing a series like this? It is being able to put this imagery that isn't available online and make sure that, yeah, people have their foundation building blocks of fashion. Do you find that that's kind of missing when people research just online?
Well, you know, I mean, research, yeah, fine. I mean, it's never been easier to research. Google, you put the name in and whatever. But is it accurate? Exactly. That's the thing. And there's a big emphasis, obviously, Vogue, it is the fashion Bible, that's what it is. So the great thing about this is you go into almost the Bible of it. You know, I'm not offending any Christians out there, but, you know, I mean, you know, but you're looking at the ultimate. So you're going to the source material when it was actually written. And, you know, yeah, the internet's fine, but then you check. And you have to make sure that the details are right, because there's a lot of things on the internet that are wrong. And the one thing that Vogue has got is it equals authority. So you're saying about looking back on things, and, you know, you're seeing when it actually happened, when it was reported at the time. No one else has got that. No one else has got that lineage.
Because I do agree that you mentioned that Balenciaga isn't particularly that well known, and I'd even say the same with Givenchy. I can imagine particularly young people who are interested in fashion, or maybe people that aren't sort of specifically interested in fashion but are aware of fashion, would know Ralph Lauren and they'd know Vivienne Westwood, but Givenchy and Balenciaga, I think when we work in fashion it's almost sacrilege to say that people wouldn't have heard of them. But did you find that a bit? You know,
well, I think one of the reasons why people know something about Givenchy outside the world of fashion is Audrey Hepburn. You know, as soon as if I tell people that I'm writing about Givenchy, they say, didn't you do all the clothes for Audrey Hepburn's films? Oh, you are lucky, you know.
Tell me a little bit about that relationship, because I do want to talk about that.
Well, it was a platonic love affair, and it wasn't entirely based. It was a kind of a relationship between two people who shared an aesthetic, which perhaps can be stronger than any other emotion. And they discovered one another by chance, because Audrey Hepburn was supposed to go to Balenciaga for her clothes for Sabrina.
Wait a minute. But you're going to get really defensive now. My guy versus your guy.
Being the master that he was, he was engaged in his new collection, and he was far too busy to see this little sort of scrap that stood in the doorway of his salon. So she was dismissed. Much written about, I must say. Poor Balenciaga. It's about the only bad thing that's ever been written about Balenciaga. And he recommended her that she went to Givenchy, so we have to give him that. And then when she turned up at Givenchy's salon, naturally she gave her name Hepburn, Miss Hepburn, and he thought that it was Catherine Hepburn, was then the big number. Anyway, it turned out that in the report it says that he just wasn't able to help her. But actually what happened was that he said, why don't you look around and see if there's anything here that would suit your role in Sabrina? And having a very good eye, she said, this is exactly what we want. So she rushed back to the studio, said, I've found the answer to the clothes I'm going to wear in Sabrina. And so that's really how it all began. But he dressed her on stage, off stage, and at the end of her life, when she wasn't anymore of sort of real publicity value to him. He dressed her for all her, any kind of public appearance, and also he was a pallbearer at her funeral, and he was an executor of her will. So that's a very long relationship. It's almost a lifetime relationship.
So was it more, I was going to ask, we mentioned that, you know, Givenchy kind of pioneered that idea of the man as the brand, and I was going to ask, did he do you also think that he played a role in pioneering or escalating this interplay between fashion and celebrity that is so predominant now, but it almost was outside of fashion and celebrity? It was a more important relationship than
I think it's very difficult to decide, if you're outside it, exactly how far self-interest played a part and how far it was an emotional sort of coup de foudre. And she always looked wonderful in his clothes, but she did a fantastic job for him because she modelled all his clothes for American and British Vogue. I mean, every time he did a new collection, Audrey would turn up and be photographed by Bert Stern or someone. So they were a great use to each other. Let's put it like that.
Let's talk a little bit more about muses, and they don't actually have to be actual women or men, but did you find that a lot? Because I know with Westwood this is quite an interesting thing as well. Did you find that all the designers that you were covering did have ideas or ethoses? Maybe with Ralph Lauren it's more of an ethos that really drove their work.
Well, with Ralph Lauren, interestingly enough, he adored Audrey Hepburn and grew up watching films with her. And I think it was, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was the Coty Women's Wear, one of the major awards. She presented it to him.
She certainly wore Ralph Lauren.
Yes,
she did.
And so that was a massive achievement for him because that had been a big inspiration, or she had been a big inspiration.
Would you say she was a muse to him then? Or?
I wouldn't say she was a muse. I mean, he grew up, child of America, 1950s, watching the films, wanting to be a cowboy, wanting to be an actor, wanting to be all these things, and he was very much the sort of the American dream. So I don't think he had one specific muse. I think his muse, if anything, was sort of, I don't know, perhaps a certain kind of Hollywood glamour and a style and an elegance that went with that.
Because you wrote in a very sort of insightful way in your book about the way in which he just championed this idea of a lifestyle and this idea of
and
here's a lifestyle designer.
And that's interesting as well. When I was listening to you, Drusilla, talking about Givenchy making himself the face of the brand and wanting to be photographed, Ralph Lauren did
Very
that a
much.
lot as well.
Absolutely.
And I think probably in sort of terms of modern designers, I would say he was the biggest in terms of pushing himself as the image of the brand. But I think also he was very in touch with what people wanted in their lives and the kind of dreams that they wanted to buy in. And so, for example, his homewares really took off as a result of them acquiring more homes and wanting more things to put in them and creating these sort of fantasy lifestyles that people could then buy into. Having said that, he's very private as well. He doesn't give that many interviews. And there aren't that many books that have been written about him.
Can I ask you, Kathleen, when did you fall in love with what we could call English style, the sort of sweaters, English sports clothes, that kind of thing?
Yes, well, I think he used to come to London, I would say, in the 60s and 70s, and of course that was also when he was developing that sportswear look with a small s in America, with those sort of little hacking jackets and tweed things. And then I think that evolved, and he loved British things. He loved Fair Isle jumpers, and he loved all of that. But what he didn't like was that they were very uncomfortable. They were all prickly, and I suppose it's that.
Good point.
It's that sort of English thing of we always used to have those. Do you remember the rough bath towels? It's a very peculiar English thing, whereas Americans want everything soft and nice, and so he was very keen to sort of make a version of that fitted in with his dream of what luxury and quality should represent. But he loves tradition. He loves anything that's authentic.
Can I just interrupt? I think we have to differentiate though as well, that Ralph Lauren is fashion marketing. And this is, I hate to say this, but it's fashion. Obviously he sells clothes and he's a designer per se, but it's more marketing than design. Because his background is in retail. So, his great thing is selling, he says, I don't sell clothes, I sell dreams. Isn't that one of his things? I mean, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he sells a dream.
But I think to limit him to marketing is not fair on him, because actually one thing I learnt when I was first approached to write this book, I thought, well, I don't really know much about Ralph Lauren. I mean, he's not a Westwood, he's not a Balenciaga, he's not a Givenchy. What is he? And I realised that so many references throughout my life in terms of things that I've worn or friends have worn, or suddenly I was seeing his look everywhere, and I don't know whether that makes him, and yes, he's a fantastic marketing person, but I do think in terms of American designers, I think he's the Chanel of America, because he's taken something and moved it on.
I don't think so. He's not the Chanel of America. That's just my, no, I mean, because he's never actually designed, I mean, you know, I don't think, to be honest, I think he's amazing, but I think they're all different subjects, which is fantastic. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but what I'm saying is, you know, if you compare him with someone like Halston, I don't think you can do that. No, I know, but what I'm saying is, but Halston was designing garments, and Ralph Lauren's great strength is to sell these dreams, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's fantastic, but he doesn't actually, like this, you know, say like a Balenciaga, or get the fabric and actually construct a new idea, because a lot of his things are regurgitations, if you like, of historic garments, but put in a slightly modern way. He's not inventing anything new, and he never has. I'm not putting him down. I think what he's invented is the great American sort of dream almost.
But is that in itself not new? I would be interested, you mentioned his influence on how we dress, and I find that fascinating, because to me that is
a form of design, and I think that to dismiss it as marketing just because it's not big ball gowns, or it's not, I mean, he does that too, obviously. I mean, funnily enough, I was listening to somebody talking about plagiarism the other day, and how it's very much underestimated in terms of invention, because actually we all get ideas from familiar objects or things that we're seeing or places that we travel to. And I think with somebody like Ralph Lauren, these things did not exist until he made them wearable, until he made marketing. People want to wear them, but somebody did have to sit down and figure out how it was going to work.
I know, but what I'm saying is, what has he invented? I mean, Givenchy, the little black dress, really, virtually sort of invented that, you know, and Vivienne Punk. Ralph Lauren hasn't really invented anything. I'm talking in terms purely of garments. He's done something more than all of them put together in one way of his whole retail concept. And I'm not trying to in any way dismiss what he's about. But what I'm saying is, it's a different thing.
That's very interesting.
It's a different thing.
That talks about design now, because you know, talking about, you say he invented something more than the rest of them. It's almost like he invented a lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas the other designers perhaps invented a garment or a style.
Yeah.
But then, do you not think that's what a lot of the great designers we talk about today do? They invent this lifestyle that you want to buy into. Do you not think that's kind of what?
No, I don't think Vivienne designs a lifestyle.
No, but a lot of her designs draw on history and things that have existed before.
Is
that not the same?
No, it isn't, because she takes a historic garment, and I have to say that I don't know anyone that knows more about history of historical garments than Vivienne, bar a curator. She knows so much about. She knows the life of the Highlander. She knows the way they actually put it on. It's unbelievable how much she knows.
So would you say when she takes, because obviously it was interesting when you mentioned that historic element, because obviously that's something we know Vivienne Westwood so well for. How does she use history in her collections then? And because
she takes it apart. I mean, from the very early days, she looked at original pattern books, you know, an original, say, pirate shirt, and she recut it. That's how she did it. You know, she isn't taking an original pirate shirt, putting it in a stripe. You know what I'm saying? She reinvents it. That she's an inventor, first and foremost, and that's what this country really. That's our lineage. That's that's what we're about. We're a nation of inventors. I like to think that.
But you use the word reinvent. I mean, how few people actually do invent a new silhouette.
I agree.
mean, one thinks of Balenciaga and his chemise, which I suppose was an original invention. Well, my man refined it.
Your man
Sorry, it's really defensive.
I love how passionate you all are.
He's really good.
Brilliant.
We're fighting our corners.
I feel like we should have an audience vote at the end on who everyone sides with.
Could I say something about historic?
Yeah, of course. I'd like to talk about that a bit more.
Because it's interesting, I think, what you're both saying. I mean, you know, what's plagiarism and what's creativity is a very difficult question. And actually, just as you were talking, I was looking at this, the cover of the Balenciaga book. I don't know if you can see, it's this famous mantle coat, as it was called. And this is an example of how you can take a historical garment and invent something totally, I would say totally new, even though you've been very inspired by it. He was inspired here by well, I don't know this for a fact. We know he was very inspired by the Japanese kimono, many aspects of it. And this is one. In those ukiyo-e prints that you can see sort of Japanese geishas wearing their layers of kimonos. And as you wore layers of kimonos, you could wear up to 12. You wanted everyone to see the fabulous fabric of each one underneath. And so they wore them kind of down their sleeves like that, down their arms. You could see a little bit. And he's done this. It's like the folds of a kimono falling down your arm. That's what he was inspired by there. But there is nothing in the world like that, and it doesn't look like a kimono.
That's what I mean. It's a couture. I mean, look at the photograph on the back where he's actually got the white coat on and he's doing the garment. That's a couture. That mean, when I saw Vivienne recently, walked in the studio, she's sitting there, doing a knitted garment, which she told me she'd done from 10 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. She's still inventing, she's still creating. The hands-on of the fabric and the knowledge and everything that goes with being a designer.
I'm interested in this idea of history. I want to keep talking about that a little bit, because one thing that I think people often think about Balenciaga is the new, and I think that's often what we decide makes a great designer, is them doing something that's completely new. But you've mentioned that he wasn't afraid to draw on history a little bit.
A lot,
yeah. Tell me more about it, because there's a great bit in your book where you said what Balenciaga does today, other designers will do tomorrow, and there is always this sense of him being a pioneer, and I find that you can unpick these historical influences quite interesting.
Well, I mean, in fact, he had a huge collection of historical garments in 19th century and 18th century as well, maybe even a little bit older. And that collection was shown, it was still owned by his family, and was shown at the Musée Galliera in Paris not that long ago, in fact, last year. So he had an enormous collection, and they showed his own garments alongside ones that could have influenced those particular garments they don't know. So not at all afraid to draw on history. Loved those old fabrics. You were talking about muses, and I was thinking, well, what inspired Balenciaga? I think it was fabric itself. The fabric, it's the feel of it. That was his muse. So not at all afraid to do a sort of 19th century looking dress in sort of black lace, something very Victorian. And, not afraid to do something that actually maybe he didn't even alter that much from the original. I don't know if it matters or not, because alongside that, he could be so inventive and creative, and he was the great pioneer.
But people can't replicate what Balenciaga did anyway, because we haven't got the fabrics now. Yeah. I mean, people aren't dressing like that anymore. People aren't spending that kind of money anymore. So it's a totally different world, and I think that's the other thing, is we have to put things in their era.
Yeah. I want to go to that in a second and ask about the times that all the different designers you covered were working. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about the history with someone like Givenchy, because he's known as being a very classic designer. Tell me a little bit about...
Well, I think he's rather... he is thought of as a classic designer, but actually he started off as an innovator. If you look at the way his first collections were reported, it was that he was the breakthrough, the new name. He introduced the idea of separates, which was the sort of way in which we all dress today, but the pieces were made to kind of Paris couture standards, and they could be worn a number of different ways. And he was innovative in all sorts of ways, notably in that his collections always started on the tick of time, whereas anyone who's been to Paris collections knows you're normally hanging around for hours. Anyway,
Jacobs is bringing that back, which is good.
That was part of his background. But he was absolutely steeped in French culture, French design. And that was why he was called on to design Jackie Kennedy's dress when she turned up at the Versailles, Paris, when the Kennedys visited France. And if you look at the embroidery there, it was just absolutely exquisite.
So do you think it's unfair that people do see him as being sort of so in line with sort of pre-war couture and so classic?
No, I think overall it's a correct assessment. I mean, he thought of himself as someone who, carried on the tradition of Balenciaga. That was his one great dream in life. And Balenciaga, as we've heard, was very much rooted in the art of haute couture. So overall, he was a conventional designer, but he started off with fireworks. In fact, I think it's perhaps arguable that Balenciaga wasn't all that good for him. I mean, I think he he was very French, very Gallic, very light-hearted, sort of amusing to begin with, but he learnt to despise that. I mean, once he fell in love with Balenciaga.
Well, you would, wouldn't you? What can I say? Well, you might be right. But then on the other hand, it could be that the sort of strength and sort of austerity, as well as that Balenciaga combined with lightness. That's this kind of rigour with lightness. That's a great balance.
Well, that was very good for Givenchy.
But I think all the designers really admire, if you like, Balenciaga because of his incredible construction. You know, the way,
exactly.
you know, I mean,
the making.
Yeah. Yeah, but also the proportion and the perfection, because people strive for that level of perfection, even if they can't actually sort of achieve it themselves. But it's very interesting to say someone like Vivienne Westwood is, you know, she's mad about Dior. And in later years, you know, she has taken it, and then she had to stop looking at it, you know, because it was found that she was referencing too much. So it's not just historic garments, you know, from hundreds of years ago. It is 20th century designers as well.
I want to pick up a little bit on, you mentioned construction. I do want to ask that with Vivienne Westwood, because I find her an incredibly interesting designer, because there's almost sort of two strands at play. You know, she's known very much for her ethos and her attitude and her spirit, but her clothes, you know, the construction side, and you mentioned it before with her knowledge of historical garments, is incredible. And she has also redefined silhouettes in her own way as well. Talk to me a little bit about the difference between maybe how she's perceived, but also her skill as a designer, because people often say she's an incredibly overlooked designer in terms of her actual skill.
I don't know whether I don't think she is overlooked, actually, because what she said to me was, she said she's almost, I'm paraphrasing, you know, made a rod for her own backshes, because people always come to her for inventive cuts. That's what they come to her for. So she always has to come up with these new ways of cutting. I mean, say this top, for instance, is from the Anglomania range, where she's gone back into her archives and reworks past inventions, if you like, but in a different fabric that can be washable and whatever. But also, you know, she was talking about recycling, for instance, you know, long before anyone else was doing it. She's the only designer in history to sort of really actively discourage buying clothes and says, you know, you shouldn't buy too many clothes, because, you know, she just believes in that. But, you know, she creates and has created, you know, like the Buffalo collection, for instance, when she was working with Malcolm McLaren, you know, when they were in partnership, and obviously they I wouldn't say invented punk, but they created that whole sort of concept. With the Buffalo collection, for instance, he just said to her, you know, do it all in muddy colours. And she took that direction and then did the whole collection virtually single-handed. I think she's appreciated sort of internationally. You know, I really do.
People have said, you know, she's never been put in the running for in the same way as other designers for these top jobs, and I think
I mean, come on, who would employ Vivienne? Come on. So she's too much of a maverick.
You don't think she's overlooked at all?
No, not at all. She's her own person. She's done her own thing always. She's never played the game. She's carried on doing her thing. She's 73 years old. She cycles around London. She's totally straightforward. I mean, I think she's an amazing person. When the last time I saw her, I showed her a copy of the book, and we went for a drink in the bar opposite her studio. And someone came up to her and said, this youngish guy came up and he said, he says, would you mind if my girlfriend had a photograph? And, you know, people are always coming up to her because obviously she's very, very recognisable. And I turned to Vivienne and I said, God, I says, you must get that all the time. And she said, well, I think it's punk. She said, it gave me a lot of credibility. And I said to her, well, actually, Vivienne, I don't know how much the younger generation are that aware of punk. Because I know my students, for instance, when I gave them all a piece of paper and said, can you write down the year of punk? I don't mean the exact year, but roughly the year. I had everything from 1942 to 2010.
Good 1940s punk, that would have been interesting.
Well, you know, I mean, so this is what I mean. So it isn't that. And I think she's quite, I wouldn't say puzzled, but she's not an attention seeker. She's a very private person. She's not someone who sits on the phone all the time. She's just into what she does. And I think that she's quite puzzled sometimes how people are kind of almost attracted to her. And I said to her, maybe I don't know whether I'm right when she said about punk. And I said, well, I think it's because you're real. And I do. I think it's because she believes passionately in what she does. Also, for her age, she is quite incredible, really. To just be actively doing. She just loves it so much. And she said recently she's been looking back on her life, and what she is above everything is she's just kept at it. And I think when we talk about what qualities designers need, I think that's a big quality. You have to keep at it.
You agree there?
I think one of the things that's very important about Balenciaga is that he, as I said, he was actually born in the 19th century.
Yeah.
He closed his house just after the student revolt in Paris in '68. He spanned all those years, he kept at it. And you were talking about Westwood, and I was thinking how similar in many ways. I think it was Pauline de Rothschild who said that Balenciaga lived in a world of dreamed beauty. He lived in his own dreamed world. I can imagine that though Vivienne's very connected to her political causes, in a sense it's that same thing. You create your own aesthetic world and live in it. So that some people create a lifestyle, and he sort of created a sort of aesthetic life, which I think is a different thing. He just spanned so many historical events as well. But what's interesting about him too is that while he was the pioneer, created many of the shapes throughout the 50s, he created pretty much the entire fashion vocabulary. At the same time, he also resisted modernity in many ways. He never broke into pret-a-porter. He remained purely a couturier. Like Vivienne, he was his own man. He just did his own thing.
Well, I think what's great about him in some ways is he closed his salon when he said, didn't he, that there's no one else left to dress. And in the parallels, really, in a way, is that Vivienne says almost at the age of elegance is gone. She can't believe the way that people dress now. And she said long before anyone else that she predicted almost she called it the brain-damaged dress sense of the tracksuit and trainer generation. When she said it, people were quite outraged. But actually, she in lots of ways, she was right, because when I was younger, you'd spend all day making an outfit or getting dressed up. There's this whole virtual world now to distract people, and she was onto that a long, long time ago. And, and she believes, I suppose, like the other designers, that, she says you have a better life if you wear impressive clothes. So the political, yes, but the clothing as well, and believes that the two can work hand in hand.
This leads us really nicely to that point you made before, and I really want to pick up on that, and this idea of the times in which designers are working in, because obviously the designers we're talking about here today, they're not all working at the same time, so it's almost unfair to compare them about certain things. And I do want to go back to talk about Ralph Lauren, because I think it's incredibly interesting, the climate he works in and the way, because we've had that discussion about lifestyle versus design, and I think
what's really interesting is that when you said Vivienne is 73, 74, I mean, Ralph Lauren I think is 75, I want to say 74, 75. And they are, yes, he is. And in what I think is very interesting is they both represent, I mean, you can't think of a more English designer probably than Vivienne. Same for Ralph with America. There is that very, intrinsic, almost national sense to what they do. I forgot what the question was now.
I just wanted to ask about the times they're working. Do you think he's a very modern designer?
He is really modern. I mean, he's been there before we were there. So in the sort of the 70s, he was doing sports, where, as I said, separates, just as that was taking off, just before that took off. And he was, one of the first designers to pick up on the great kind of love of Americana, that sort of Navajo quilting, those sorts of things. And then, in the late 80s, early 90s, he totally, with his whole polo sport line, he really captured what people wanted to wear in terms of sportswear. Sorry, tracksuits probably, but with the whole rise of lycra being a really important fabric and a really important, he's a modern designer, I think.
Do you think he is moved by aesthetics, or is it, as we said before, is it that aspirational lifestyle rather than?
He's always said he doesn't design fashion. I mean, I think he is very much moved by what people want and what he thinks people want, and I think he sort of gives people what they want before you know what you want, in a way. He's one step ahead.
Would you say that? I think that's very interesting.
I'm quite perplexed. I'm not trying to pick on you. No, but I mean, what he's not giving people anything new.
But what's Vivienne giving that's new? I mean, we've all had the corset, we've all had the pirate.
No one did the corset. No.
She does what she does brilliantly.
No one had the corset made in the way with a zip up the back and lycra and stretch before she did it. No one.
But is there not
didn't.
something new about...
No one.
They didn't have Lycra before. I mean, she's a Lycra generation, same as he's a Lycra generation. They didn't have Lycra in Balenciaga's day.
No. What I'm saying is she took an original corset and reinvented it. She took partly the corsetry, but then reinvented it, the zip up the back and stretch and whatever.
Yes.
And also we're not forgetting punk, which is still around now, and it was invented. Ralph Lauren has not invented anything. He hasn't invented a new garment. And as I've said earlier, what he has invented is the incredible, and it's not demeaning it, the selling of a lifestyle. But that's not to put that down, because there's many a designer who tries to design who doesn't sell anything. So he should be up there for most fashion designers, looking at him thinking, yes, look at the bigger picture, because that's what he does. He looks at the shop, he looks at that, and I'm not in any way demeaning it. I'm saying that he's a real benchmark for designers, that you've got to look outside the garment.
I was going to say, do you not think any young designer working today, I think more and more, especially with the internet, it's about doing both. You can't just do one.
Of course it is. It's about, and that's the problem with most of them. They're like this, designing a garment and not thinking, how's it going to be sold? Who is going to wear it? Above
and there's
everything.
something wonderfully accessible about what he does, in the sense of it is inviting people into a world.
Of course.
And I think that's
he's the master at it. Look, that shop on Bond Street, I mean, it's just incredible. But it's in the same way that Rosemary Bravo took a which was then kind of dying on its feet, Burberry. She was from Saks Avenue, came over to this country and sold it back to the British. That's what she did, because only an American can do that.
Yes,
we can't see it from inside. They can take a dream, a lifestyle, whatever, and reinvent it and package it, and we want it, you know? And that's what they're absolutely the best at. They are. And you know, designers, I've seen a lot of students, you know, and 99.9% of them don't look beyond the garment. And unless they have a benefactor or the late Isabella Blow, someone like that, or modern day Daphne Guinness, who is going to promote them, back them, connect them, where do these fantastically talented people go, you know?
Linda, don't you feel though that's changing now? Because I know at St Martin's, where I taught for a long time, but now there's much more of an emphasis on learning about the marketing side, not only depending on your brilliant creativity, because there's just been, you know, so many casualties, so many people have, you know, gone belly up, and now there is a real new thrust and a much more realistic one. Whether it's going to make for less creativity, I don't know. It probably will.
I'm just thinking, Drusilla, about, because I know our common love is of the late Jean Muir, who's very, you know, an amazing designer, who not a lot of young fashion students really know about now.
No, they don't know about it.
I remember her saying, she said to me once, she said, I can't remember exact words, if a product is great and it's done beautifully, it will find its own market. But maybe that was an era thing. I don't know.
I think that was then, and ours now.
Do you think there is so much now that, you know, as you say, it wouldn't be possible to be a Balenciaga today? You have to court the press and you need to promote yourself. What do you think?
I mean, there aren't many people doing it from that age, are there? You know, and into it like he was. I mean,
well, I mean, yes, I think he, when he stopped, it was because you certainly could no longer continue being a pure couturier, certainly, and that was very tied up with the kind of construction, the kind of pioneering that he did. And there's a kind of lovely story about, after he retired, he had 2 final jobs, one of which was he was asked by Air France to design their uniform for all their stewardesses, and this seemed like a great moment for him, the great couturier, but asked to do something that was both jet-setting and democratic, which he'd always been seen as a great elitist, even a snob. You know, that's one of the things in the 60s he was started to be seen as. So he's made this outfit, but he wanted to couture fit all 1,300 of the stewardesses, and he wanted to get them all to Balenciaga, and he couldn't do it. So he actually set up a sort of the tailor's fitting room in a hangar at the airport, at Orly Airport, and sort of semi-fitted them all. But as in a Greek tragedy, his very desire to do things the right way by his own lights meant that he failed tragically, because once they got into the air, the changes in cabin air pressure meant that these fitted suits became too tight, and their bodies swelled. The very fact he'd couture fitted them sort of made them uncomfortable. So it was like, it's just a fabulous image of like at that moment couture no longer kind of works with modern life.
But the thing is as well that the fabrics were different.
They were totally.
So I mean now you'd have some stretching, so you'd be able to sort of you know.
Even so, over 1 million were made, and they were worn for 10 years. I mean, I think, but it's Terylene was not really his choice of fabric.
Or anything. Yeah. No, I mean, there are some amazing fabrics now, you know, which obviously, you know, for corporate uniforms, people can standardise them because you've got this slight give in the fabric. You know.
Well, smart fabrics now that can control body heat and that kind of thing, or respond to body heat.
But I was just thinking, when you were talking about Balenciaga, I think there are certain designers as well who either can't, well, it's not because they won't, they just can't compromise. They can't. I think of someone like Hussein Chalain. I remember seeing him as a student and thinking he's more fine artist than fashion designer, and he is. When you see furniture being transformed into a garment, you know, he doesn't want to do, and it's not his thing to do, garments that someone can buy and wear and whatever. So it's kind of horses for courses, you know, who's good at one thing and who's good at another thing.
Balenciaga did do both. I mean, that was one of the interesting things about him. He was also famed as making the most comfortable suits, the most comfortable day clothes, and partly why his couture clients were so wedded to him was that once you'd worn a suit by him, it was just the most comfortable thing.
That's actually one thing I want to pick up on, because that's one thing I noticed after I'd read all the books. It struck me that we've all said they're very diverse designers, but one thing that I felt, and I'm sure you'll all disagree with me, I think that unites them is this sense of ease, and by that I don't mean necessarily just comfort, though it might be comfort in the sense of Balenciaga or separates in the cases you want to, but it is this sense of ease for the wearer and clothes that are respectful of the wearer, whether it's with Westwood empowering her, whether it's with Ralph Lauren inviting her into a lifestyle, but it definitely they all seem to put the wearer first, which I don't actually think is the case of all great designers. I don't know if
well, with Givenchy, it was an absolute article of faith, and anyone who studies Givenchy's clothes knows that they're always based on the fact that, but he made rather exaggerated claims that, you know, if a woman was free to move her arms naturally and her legs naturally, she would be happy. Well, I mean, that might be pushing it a bit, but anyway, I mean, his basic principle was that you had to be comfortable, and if you look at his clothes, and of course he was always following Balenciaga, but he did make a lot of modifications on Balenciaga, and I think he was, on the whole, probably Susan will disagree with me, easier to wear, and more people could wear Givenchy than Balenciaga. You didn't have to be tall, for example. I mean, tall people look wonderful in Balenciaga, I remember them, but Givenchy, you could be a little French.
Well, that's interesting what you say. I mean, actually, Susan Train, the Paris bureau chief for US Vogue at the time, said to wear Dior, you have to be pretty, to wear Balenciaga, you have to be stand right, she said, although she was tall, and have a certain style. But he loved small, sort of rather squat Spanish women. The famous line is, Mr. Balenciaga loves a little stomach, is one of his, I don't know how to pick that accent, but one of his top sort of pattern cutters said, or maybe it was a vendeuse, Mr. Balenciaga likes a little stomach. I mean, what designer can you say that of today? It was fantastic, he did, he loved the stomach. It's a great female attribute that we denigrate now.
But I mean, I think that, you know, Vivienne in the early days, one of the big criticisms about her, and she got it all the time, was that things were unwearable. And some of the things were unwearable, but not all of them. And, you know, I mean, you know, if you go back to punk, and she did with Mark McLaren, you know, it was a two-way thing. He said, well, let's put it, and another thing about Vivienne I have to say is she always gives credit where it's due to whoever has invented something. She said, I invented it. He said, let's put the bum flap on the back, and she said, let's do it in terry-telling. And anyway, but in the early days, a lot of the things, and I remember I worked on a couple of collections with her in the early days, and some of them were unwearable, you know, with boning coming out, whatever. But they were kind of statements, and they were experiments. That's what they were. But as time has gone on, fabrication's changed. She changed her direction as well. She's changed it a lot. Is that her things are very wearable now, but I don't ever think she's really, that's never been kind of uppermost in her mind. Where I think really, in my opinion, I think the designer the British designer who was the ultimate in comfort was Ossie Clark.
But I guess maybe, you know, when I say ease, I don't necessarily mean comfort. I mean empower. I think, you know, perhaps her clothes aren't wearable, but she's definitely always put a focus on empowering the wearer.
But I think they are all wearable now. I think she's developed incredibly, you know, and in the early days things were wearable, some things weren't because they were made whatever. But you know, we've got to think as well though of advances in fabrication has made a huge impact. Balenciaga stopped at a certain time. If Givenchy was designing now, he'd probably be doing maybe a little black dress in a different kind of fabric. And Ralph Lauren obviously embraces the whole, because the business and the brand is so wide. There's all these incredible fabrications. So I think we haven't to forget that they were very much a product of their time. You know,
it's a very good point. They were all these four were products of their era.
Yeah.
I do want to ask a little bit. You just mentioned sort of the little black dress, and I noticed it particularly when I was reading the first 4 books in the series when we were talking Chanel and Dior, that there are several designers who are known for that one iconic look or shape. And I'm interested because we were talking about this before we went live. You said that, you know, the designers that are known more, so someone like McQueen I don't think is known for an iconic shape, whereas with Givenchy it's the little black dress, with Chanel, you know, the tweed suit. Did you find that when you were researching, there was anything that kind of surprised you and took away that notion of a designer just being about one particular thing?
Yes, as far as Givenchy was concerned, I was surprised to find that he was such an innovator in terms of fabrics. He worked a lot with the Lurex, for example. He did astonishing sort of beachwear made out of bucol, and he was really not only inventive in terms of. I don't think he had the science to actually technically develop the fabric, but he worked with scientists. And like Balenciaga, he was in love with fabrics, really, and he was, I think, one of the tremendously creative in the way in which he kind of mixed fabrics, and that really astonished me. Fur, leather, every kind of textile, and I think that came from his background because his grandfather owned the Gobelin and Beauvais textile factories, and so I think that was fed into his DNA in some way.
But why do some designers get known so much for an iconic look? Because you can't say it's something that makes a designer great that they're known for a key look, because as we've mentioned, you know, Westwood, I know we'd throw out like the corset and certain pieces like that, but I don't think she's known for one look, neither's McQueen.
Well, I would like to say that whether a silhouette photographs well, I don't know whether you would all agree, has a very powerful influence on the longevity of a design. I mean, you know, Dior and Givenchy's little black dress just looks too ravishing when you photograph it. You know, it's almost a fail-safe.
But also, Drusilla, I'm just thinking in terms of Givenchy, when you think about what his muse, if you like, you know, Audrey Hepburn, she's only with Marilyn Monroe really is one of the eternal icons. So he will be forever remembered because of she is an eternal. There are so very few women who still inspire other women. But
then the Dior's new look, you know, that's not in the same way where it's inspired, where it's sort of being pushed forward by a celebrity association, and I'm just interested in that point where a look becomes so iconic to a designer, because I know Westwood has key looks, I know McQueen has key looks, but something becomes to symbolise that designer's work so in such a sort of symbolic way, and whether that makes.
But also that's to do with the designer, because Givenchy, for instance, wasn't in the business of keep reinventing himself and doing new looks. I mean, he had this, didn't he? This very classical look that he developed, whereas someone like Vivienne Westwood just not intentionally has moved from punk to pirate to buffaloes to this to that, but in later years has had a long span being inspired by Dior, and later on, you know, so it's very much a reflection of the designer attitude.
But
and
would
what
we
they're
not say
about.
That someone like Dior changed his shape just as often? Was it just because that collection caused so much of a furore?
I think it was with Dior. I mean, he
It
was
was
known
Dior.
for changing his shape very often. I mean, even twice a year. But that was the, I would say, the most famous fashion show of all time, the 1947 New Look. I don't know. Do you think it was?
But also, I mean, you know, it's a bit like, you know, I don't know, someone like parallels with, you know, have Hollywood movie stars who die quite early. They have a short career, so obviously they haven't had time to sort of develop on from that. You know, like McQueen, I think will always be remembered maybe for the for the bumster trousers and the shoulder line and whatever. You know, but longevity is very difficult to achieve. I mean, how many designers do it? And I do think that's one reason why Vivienne Westwood, for instance, is admired. How long she's been at it.
Yeah.
She's been doing it since the early 70s and is still doing it. And that takes some doing.
As has Ralph Lauren.
You're like, but that must, I think, I'm so jealous of you guys in a way, pouring through all these archives and looking at the span of these designers' careers, because that must be one thing that is so fascinating. I think for someone doing, like, if you've been researching Dior, you must have found this with Givenchy and Balenciaga and Westwood as well. They're known for these looks, but there's so much more to all of them. And I kind of insinuated this before Drusilla, but I'd love to know, were there any things you found in the archive that just seem completely different to what we would know? Because I was looking in the Givenchy book, I was showing you, Kathleen, that amazing Givenchy jewellery photo. And were there any? What you would expect, it's not what you'd expect. Were there any points in the archive where you were truly, really surprised, whether it was a look or a statement made about the designer? Was there anything that unearthed a new side of your guy or girl?
Well, for me, actually, Balenciaga was always known as this great, austere, dignified, dark Spanish figure. And I have a whole chapter where I talk about his sense of humour. Yeah. I feel it's been very overlooked. That's interesting. People say he was thinking of muse, and I was thinking, my God, if he had a muse, it would be the Virgin Mary. You know, both in terms of some of the garments he made, and he actually made garments for religious statues. So people talk about his religious side and his purity, and they get carried away with this, and it's there. But he was incredibly funny. Yeah. There's Kennedy Fraser, who was a former fashion critic, spoke of his snort. Some of his clothes, they just elicit a snort from you, a snort of satisfaction and sort of humour. And I think that really surprised me. Yeah. No one had spoken about it before.
Did you all find it you wanted to shed a new light on the designer you were working with? Because I do think we feel like we know great designers in a sense, and we pigeonhole them, as you say, Balenciaga, very austere, almost snobbish, you mentioned before. Did anyone else find a new side to their
Well, I think it was a question of interpreting. I mean, as a writer, you were interpreting the facts that you had before you. And I felt that the best I could do for Givenchy was to cast him in the light of a kind of contemporary entrepreneur, which I hadn't read before. Yeah. And so that's just my view of him. But I think the point about couturiers is that anyway, they're so artistic and so wide-ranging that you tend not to be surprised by any unusual creative act. You almost expect it. I mean, that's what they're about.
Yeah, that's a really good... You must have found that with Westwood. You expect the unexpected with her, didn't you?
Well, I've known Vivienne since 1987. I met her on the night I graduated. Long story. Which I won't go into. Doing a television programme, doing a chat show in Newcastle. I happened to be the reception she was at afterwards, and I ended up working with her on a couple of collections. I do think it's different to write a book if you know
I was going to ask that, writing about someone who...
Sorry, it's different. It's different writing about someone who you know, because you're very conscious that they're going to read it. When I saw her last night at the party, she said, I haven't read it yet.
Oh, no.
And that's fine. That's fine by me. She does like it. I gave her a copy. She went through the pictures. She really likes the pictures. Not mad about the front cover. That's fine. But she'll say she looked through it. She really liked the pictures and whatever. But it's completely different when you know someone. Completely different if they're not around anymore, because you then haven't got, if you like, anyone. I'm not saying to answer to, but there's a certain freedom about writing about someone who you don't know. So in that way, but I interviewed her extensively for it, a lot more actually than I could put in this, unfortunately, because there were about 15,000 words I think that we wrote, and also it was all kind of fashion related. But even I, having known her, very rarely see her, but have known her all these years, always get a Christmas card. She's a very genuine person, and when even I discovered new things about her, which was great.
Did you do it through?
No, when I saw her again, and talking to her, I think she's completely underestimated in lots of ways. I think she's portrayed in the media as this mad, eccentric. Yeah, she's eccentric, but she certainly isn't mad. She's much shrewder than people give her credit for. Yeah. She's an incredibly intelligent woman. She doesn't always put her point across clearly, and I think this is where often the lines get blurred, but believes passionately in what she does. But I discovered new things, and when she was talking to me, for instance, I was showing her pictures, and she was I think there was one picture where it was a wrap, and she was telling me how it had been based on the life of the Highlander, and she was almost showing you how the Highlander wore this garment and everything, and that's when I've always known she knew about history. I didn't realise how much she actually knew.
She spent a lot of time in the V&A.
Yeah,
she actually?
yeah. But she's on really is a curator in the amount that she knows, and all self-taught, I might add, because she never trained to be a designer. She just did it by cutting butterick. She always made her own garments and butterick patterns, and obviously she started in the early days doing shops with Malcolm McLaren and the Teddy Boys and whatever. I mean, it's a very interesting story, but that's it really. I mean, she's a fascinating woman, and I think it really, to the outsider, and a bit like we're saying Ralph Lauren, but to the outsider, I think the outside will look at Vivienne really as, especially in the Far East, I mean, they worship her as this sort of icon of sort of Englishness, quintessential Englishness. Almost of a bygone sort of era, but really she's been training to do what she does all her life. So they've all got their own individual stories. But one thing I was thinking about when you were saying about Balenciaga meeting when he was 12, you were saying another quality which I think young designers, or if young designers are watching, is that phrase, isn't it? Fortune favours the brave. And I think the fact that he
stepped forward.
Yeah, he stepped forward and said something. You have to, I think, for any students that are watching in fashion, must grab the opportunities. And that is one thing that, say, for instance, McQueen did with Isabella Blow, because I was at Vogue at the time, and at the show, which were grabbing the opportunity, and everyone needs someone, everyone needs some kind of like support network and whatever. And I do think that people, I think that kind of almost sums it up. And Vivienne, she met Malcolm McLaren. It just happened. He was a friend of her brother's, sleeping in her brother's car. Oh, who's she? And they got to know each anyway, and started from a retail side, really. And just making clothes, and that's how it happened. But they're all individually fascinating stories, really, because they're all so different, aren't they?
Well, it also shows you can come from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yes.
And that's very important too. I mean, you couldn't have come from a less unlikely background than this kind of working class macho northern Spanish sort of setup that Balenciaga was in, and yet he seems to have, having said that, everyone, he went off and trained to be a tailor. That was how you got into fashion, I suppose, out of that background.
I just wanted to ask Drusilla a question, actually. Had you met Givenchy before you wrote this book?
No.
Right.
I met Dior, but I didn't.
Right.
I hadn't met Givenchy.
Oh, how
but
great to have met Dior.
He answered some questions.
Tell us about meeting Dior. I know that's not part of the panel, but I really want to know.
Well, I mean, he was so deeply retiring, and I was a very young journalist and of absolute no interest to him at all. But I was just totally enchanted by his New Look collection, which incidentally, Givenchy, I won't say dismissed, but when I talked to him about New Look, he said, important for the image of fashion, but it lasted for only one season. So that was pretty dismissive, really. I mean, he was a great genius, Dior, and I agree with whoever said that if you were pretty, you looked particularly. He was a French romantic, and he seemed to belong to the whole history of French portraiture. I can't tell you anything very interesting about him because he wasn't really interested in being interesting to me.
But still, to meet him.
But what was Givenchy like then when you met him?
No, I didn't meet him. I only answered questions.
Oh, I see.
He was friendly, articulate, as courteous as you would expect him to be. But he was also quite contradictory because, anyway, in the early research suggested that his view was that the couture had finished. But in our exchange of question and answer, he said, I'm absolutely convinced that there will be a kind of couture that's going to continue. He always saw it as sort of super ready to wear and not haute couture as we know it. But he felt that someone was going to come along and create a standard of ready to wear clothes that would be sort of almost as good as couture, and he always saw it sort of continuing in a way.
I think it's a final question, and I'm afraid it only applies to two of the authors, which is Balenciaga, not the authors, the designers, Balenciaga and Givenchy. And I want to talk about houses being continued when the designer is no longer there. What do you both think about what we see at Balenciaga, what we see at Givenchy, and how is the best way to continue a house?
Well, I think Galliano, wasn't the most perfect person to inherit the house of Givenchy, but now we've got Riccardo Tisci, and I say we. It's
such pride. I love
loyalty is creeping in. He seemed, anyway, to me, that it got to get it back on track, and he's come through St Martin's, which is a great source of pleasure to me, and also he seems to me to, although he's the. I read, but I didn't know that he was the only person not to mention Audrey Hepburn in his sort of job application and in his interviews. I think that was right.
Why?
Because I feel that you can't go on pinning a house to a sort of so-called muse icon, really. And I think that the house of Givenchy's got a lot of capital out of Hepburn, and it's time really that sort of move it on from there. Anyway, that was his view, and I myself think that was the sort of right policy.
Tell us a little bit about Balenciaga and seeing that, because Balenciaga's had an interesting journey as a house.
He has. I mean, when he closed his doors forever, and I think it was Mona Bismarck who closed her door for 3 days. She didn't come out of her bedroom. These women went to break down because there was no one left to dress. His house kind of foundered. It really kind of, they got, for a while, Ramona Esparza, who'd been his design assistant, was designing. That just didn't work. It kind of went downhill, more and more obscure. And then in about 1995, when it was owned, I think, by a perfume manufacturer, somebody there hired Nicolas Guesquière to design funeral clothes for the Japanese market, oddly. And out of those weird beginnings that seem to be quite common in fashion, he grew to be a very influential designer. What he particularly did, you ask about the continuation of the house, he seems to have blossomed as a designer at the very moment that he went into the archive. He said this himself in interviews. Exactly. Went into the archive and actually looked at this incredible man's work, which at that point had disappeared from view. People knew Balenciaga was the greatest, but they didn't know about his clothes. I think that's still quite true. But he started being very influenced by them. He also created something called Les Éditions. Every year he would specifically take things from the archive and kind of reimagine them a bit or do different fabrics. And he had an homage collection as well in 2006. But I don't know, is that, should you keep a house like Balenciaga alive or shouldn't you? I don't know. I don't know what it means. It's just a brand in some way, isn't it? Although I feel, as I say, Guesquière did manage to recreate, reinvent using Balenciaga's impetus. Moot point, I don't know. Is that, should the house die with the designer? Should Westwood die with Westwood in the end or go on?
Well, I mean, I think it should go on, but I don't know what plans are, I shouldn't say that, but, there is so much there to reinvent and to reuse. So I should imagine that the company will carry on, because at the moment, as I said about the Anglomania range, which is the more affordable range, if you like, they're constantly going back into, I think really what we have to realise is it's almost like an encyclopedia of all these different sort of cuts and whatever that could be redone. In the case of Balenciaga and Givenchy, they're almost moving the brand away sometimes from what the origins were. Whereas with Vivienne, it's the same designs sometimes, just being made in new fabrics. So revisiting the archives. I don't know, it's quite a complicated sort of point, but...
Could we think about McQueen and the way in which that house has been developed? I think very successfully.
Well, I think it's better actually, personally.
It's really, really well done. It's got a lot of McQueen in it, but on the other hand, it does seem to belong to now.
Yes,
well, I actually prefer it now.
Why do you prefer it now?
I think it's more wearable.
Much more wearable.
You know, I didn't like what McQueen... I'm not a McQueen fan, anyway, but I'm not. I don't think he was a genius. You know, I mean, I knew him long before he was discovered, and I'm saying, oh, I knew him, but I did. He was working with a friend of mine at Koji Tatsuno, and actually, you know, and I was at the show when Izzy made him, you know, whatever, but that's another story. But as far as Givenchy's concerned, he did not have the ability really to take over that. And I remember when he went to Givenchy, sort of, you know, almost slating Hubert de Givenchy, which, you know, come on, and all these other people, okay, the bit of the bad boy, but did not have the technique to back it up. And his early collections for Givenchy were universally slated, and even he said they were crap, you know. So it's a very tricky thing, taking on a brand and moving it on. You know, when it's been so identifiable with a certain period.
But I think it depends on the period at which the new name takes over, because we're now, it seems to me, to be living through a rather more kind of conventional, conformist stage in terms of fashion. So, I mean, the houses that were famous for innovation and revolution are not going to move in that direction.
But how many people are actually, I mean, I think you'd agree with this. I mean, you know, with the St. Martin's and all the other colleges, there's as much talent now as there's always been. But what there isn't are people actually nurturing the talent. You know, the people who are discovering.
Even in London, where we have
no, I would thought more here than... Where would you go if you were a young designer other than here?
Yeah, but I mean, who is actually... I mean, what are... You know, who's been the big, significant, successful and person who's had designer who's had impact in the past sort of 10, 20 years?
From London? Christopher Kane?
I think quite a lot.
He's not Balenciaga, is he? Not Givenchy. Not my opinion, anyway.
I'm into
Givenchy and Balenciaga come along once.
Well, that's what. Yeah, I know, but that's what we're. And I know that, but that's what, in a way, what we're dealing with are these icons of design. There's got to be a new Balenciaga or Westwood or whatever around. Where are they? Often they get lost because they haven't got the confidence, they haven't got the backer, they're not in the right place at the right time. And, you know, there's so many ingredients that go to someone being super successful. You know, self-promotion.
I would say someone like Boudica, wearing them here, are just the most incredible British designers.
Oh,
so
that's
talented.
beautiful.
Yeah,
so I do.
And very inspired
I agree.
in some ways, I would say, by Balenciaga.
Yeah.
They work on construction. It's like couture. They make ready-to-wear that's like couture. They are blazingly talented, and they've been very overlooked in some areas of the press.
I guess this goes back to what we were saying about designing in the times.
Yeah.
You have
I
to
thought that was Balenciaga what you had on when we were in the lift, and I saw you, didn't I?
That's right.
They get overlooked because the fashion writers get bored and they move on to the next person instead of looking at one person and really trying to help them, you know, and promote them and really knowing what they're about and telling their story. I mean, you know, it's all this cult of the new all the time, and then they get forgotten, and the next one, and the next one.
I think we do need people to... I mean, the way Anna Wintour really promoted John Galliano, we need a bit more of this going on. I agree.
Yeah. And backed him when you know, the terrible incident happened. It was all over the internet. And she knows he's hugely talented. She knows he was going through a very bad time. And she put her... not saying her money where her mouth is, but she actually put herself forward as supporting him. Yes. You know, and he needed support. He isn't that person.
So is that something we haven't touched on when talking about all these great designers? Is that something that makes a designer great? Is it's not actually just about the design themselves, it's about the support that they need?
Well, that brings us back to your question at the beginning, which is, and you know, Drusilla, you answered it by saying parents and having that sort of artistic background. It is about, I guess, support.
Well, I don't just think it's about having an artistic background. When Drusilla mentioned the word parents, I'm totally there with a good background, and that's not necessarily, you know, whether it's craft or, but someone being behind you, saying you can do it, and just supporting you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be parents; it could be a relative or some. But more than that, in fashion, you need the entree into that world.
Yes, you do.
And the late Isabella Blow was really, you know. She relentlessly promoted people. She didn't have an agency, she wasn't getting paid, but she felt so passionate about it. And there really aren't, not to my knowledge, so very few people doing that now, because it's very time consuming. You know, give them somewhere to, she gave Philip Tracy, you know, somewhere to live, and then you help them, and she modelled in his show, and but there's so much talent, and it's sad that it isn't being picked up on and promoted. Because money is at the bottom of it.
I was going to say,
yeah.
you just said before I did that it's whoever provides those initial funds makes the enormous difference.
Yeah.
But do you not think things like Fashion East and New Gen, I say we're in a time where there's more support. I think it's easier to be a young designer now than it probably was when no?
Well, not when you've got Primark selling dresses for like £10, £8, I'm not knocking it. But you know, when you've got that, how does a young designer make an impact? There's so many labels now. You know, I mean, there's just so much competition now. You've got the whole Chinese market to compete against, finding your niche, and also you have to be an all-rounder. You know, you need a business partner, someone who can get the finance, someone who can, so they can't do everything, you know.
Well, it's a cautious note to end on, but I feel like we could keep going forever, I think, and battle out. But thank you so much. I feel like that was absolutely fascinating, and I hope that we will see 4 young designers eventually make it as part of the Vogue On series, because I do think we've got lots of exciting talent.
Well, yeah, we all agree on that, but we're
hoping
that they find their dream person who believes in them and who can back them. Yeah,
So
I think a green bank balance is important.
Yeah, the dream address book.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.